Hello, my name is Tim Morton. I'm the head of service at Adventure RMS. We're a company which deals with inspections of quality and safety in adventure activities, both in the UK and abroad. We have contracts with the Health and Safety Executive, the Ministry of Defence, a number of police forces, the Coroner's Office, as well as other individual clients. We're a relatively new company. We started operations in April 2020, but we're about to complete our 1000th review of the safety management arrangements of adventure activities providers. Obviously, that's not me. There are 25 inspectors spread across the UK that undertake that work for us. Some of those are RYA coaches and trainers and that sort of thing, as you'd expect. The places that our inspectors visit are very different. Sometimes that's because of their location or just simple things like their size, their aims and objectives, or generally because of the people who run them or work at them. But despite those differences, there are often the same difficulties in relation to safety management, and that can spread across from the largest to the smallest providers. So this session, this 45-minute presentation, is really all about sharing with you those common areas where we see providers having difficulties, having challenges in terms of their safety management arrangements. I've got some slides to share with you as we go along. Let me just get those started. There we go. So these are, if you like, the sort of the top 5 areas where providers can find it difficult to either establish effective safety management or possibly as a secondary concern to demonstrate that effective safety management arrangements. In many circumstances, those providers and organisations are aware of the issues and challenges around these particular areas. Of greater concern is probably those organisations which are not. Whilst I've identified 5 separate areas, in reality, they're often linked. Our inspectors spend a lot of time looking for threads, as we call them, which is, for example, if you find some equipment in the stores or in the boat compound, which isn't as it should be, the chances are if you pull that thread, it will lead you to issues elsewhere. Perhaps, for example, in that case, in terms of the procurement policy. So who is it that's choosing what to buy and when to buy it? Equally, if you're observing an activity session taking place, a sailing session, and there are issues in relation to the delivery that's taking place, the chances are if you pull that thread, that might lead you back to an induction process or to the observation of instructors doing their day-to-day work. So whilst I've identified 5 areas to help us look at those and discuss them, I'm not suggesting that they operate in isolation from one another, because they don't. It did occur to me, though, when I was putting that list together, the list could also be used as a process to prepare for the coming season. That many of you will be currently preparing for your season ahead. I'm going to talk through these issues in the order that you can see them there, starting with lessons learnt from last year. And it may be that thinking back to when I was a head of centre and an RYA principal, I'd be working through these things now in order to be ready for Easter or whenever it was my season was going to start. They do stand on their own, so hopefully if you're not in that position, I think they will still be of relevance. But it did occur to me, as I say, that they do well work, they could well work in that way. Okay, so I wanted to start by looking for a moment or two about lessons learned from last year. So I guess probably the context for this is having an accident or an incident that neither you or anyone else has ever had before places you in a very different position to having the same accident or incident twice, either twice within your own arrangements or twice within the provision of sail-based activities. So that really puts an onus on ensuring that we are learning lessons from previous experience. Those lessons may well come from external sources or internal sources. Externally, obviously things like the conference you're attending today is part of that process and is an opportunity to to learn from other people's experience. So, for example, I'm aware that there's a Marine Accident Investigation Bureau session included in the conference, which you may be attending or following up after this. Obviously, the MAB also provide reports and presentations. The RYA itself, in addition to the conference, you've got regional development officers, website, wavelengths, those sorts of sources of information. For ourselves, Adventure RMS, some of you may well be aware that we have a safety management update service, which is a free service. You can join it via our website, and it will provide you with updates as and when we become aware of issues. And it would be reasonable to expect that somebody who is responsible for the safety management of arrangements of provision to have access and be aware of the information which is available in that sense. Just turning now to the internal opportunities for learning from previous seasons. This obviously requires you to have thought about it in the previous season so that you are now in a position to think about those lessons that you've learned. So a common problem for providers can be to get to the end of their season and think, well, we're going to have a review of how the season went, and we're going to think about what we learned from that, and we're going to apply that to next year. If they haven't been effective in keeping notes and records during that season, when it comes to the opportunity to spend time thinking about it, there's very little to look at and very little to base that review on. So some of the simplest things that we see folks doing is to have a master copy of their operating procedures or their risk assessments, whichever they may use, and then to encourage people to annotate those with handwritten notes as the season goes by. Some of those notes might require immediate action. Others of them will help you then conduct an effective review during the winter period. So you can think about, well, yeah, how did that go and did that work? Other things such as accident reports, observation records and those sorts of things are also really useful here. So one of the issues we come across from time to time is where providers may have viewed an accident report as the end point in that process. So they've had an accident or an incident, it's been dealt with in the first instance by the instructors and then perhaps by a chief instructor or whoever else has got involved. There's been some communications following that, an accident report has been written, and that may have well been reported under RIDDOR if it's sufficiently serious, or retained in-house. From our point of view, we'd expect that to be the start of a process, not the end of one. So that record, that report, is an opportunity to then consider that incident. So if you look at your own accident records, do they encourage that process to take place, or do they appear to suggest that once you've filled out this record and report and signed the bottom, that's the job done? So again, good ones which encourage that review process can then be brought forward during your end of year review to think about, well, what incidents and accidents did we have last year, and what did we learn from those at the time, and how do we want to apply that learning to next season? Things like morning meeting notes, observation records, feedback from clients, feedback from instructors, particularly if you have a large seasonal team or even a small seasonal team, their experiences of the year, all of those sorts of things. It's too late by the time you get to this part of your year to start trying to gather that information from individuals. Much better to have had those systems in place during your season last year so that the review you undertake now is so much more worthwhile. So people talk about the difficulties of recording instructor observations. We regularly hear chief instructors talking to us about the fact that they feel they're observing their provision all of the time, whenever they're walking around their site, whenever they're sitting in a staff meeting, whenever they're listening to clients, that they're subconsciously observing what's going on. And often they'll struggle to find time or opportunity to record any of that information. One of the reasons it's worthwhile trying to find a straightforward way to record that stuff is so that when you do get to this time of the year, you can look back at it and with a clear head decide what was dealt with and doesn't require further consideration, and what might want to be factored into next year's arrangements. So I guess the closing point in relation to learning from last year or points really is twofold. One is that I think there is a reasonable responsibility on individuals controlling adventure activity provision to be aware of what's happening in the broader delivery of the activities they're involved in. So it's not enough to know everything about your club or your organisation. There's an expectation that you would be looking beyond that. And then secondly, it's too late when you get to the winter to start thinking about, did we record any of those observations that we did? Have we got minutes of our morning staff meetings? Do we have accident records which shows some sort of reflection and review? Because without that information, then your winter review, and therefore your ability to apply any lessons you might have learnt from last year, is much reduced. The second area I wanted to look at was procedures and risk assessments. So perhaps the first question for you is if you looked at your operating procedures and your risk assessments, on what basis have you written those? Who were they written for? So we tend to see two types. We see those that are intended to reduce the likelihood of an accident, and we see others that tend to have more of an emphasis on supporting an organisation following an accident. If you aren't sure which yours might be, then one of the things to think about is, how do you provide your instructors with guidance as to how you'd like them to manage the risks that are inherent within the activities they deliver? That's probably via an operating procedure and or a risk assessment, depending on how you've organised things. If you look at whichever of those it is, does it read in a way that that particular audience are likely to engage with and understand and appreciate? That might include simple things like the format it's provided in. So is it provided in a format which your instructors can access via their phones, which is where they spend an awful lot of their free time, or is it in a file in an office on a shelf where they're much less likely to engage with it on a regular basis? So thinking about the context in which you've prepared that information, and then trying to decide whether that matches with whom you expect to use it and benefit from it. Our experience is that safety management systems which have focused on managing the risks and therefore reducing the likelihood of a serious accident or incident generally also provide support should an accident subsequently occur. These are, after all, adventurous activities. There will be accidents and incidents. So a system which focuses on managing those is likely to provide subsequent support should an organisation be challenged in relation to its safety management arrangements following an accident. One which focuses on the latter is less effective in our experience. The second point is to think about whether you need whatever it is that you're about to create within your safety management system in order to operate. The chances are, if you don't need that in order to run your provision efficiently and effectively, you probably don't need it at all. And also, if you do introduce whatever it might be, it's unlikely to be used in the way that was intended or maintained, and it then can potentially become something which undermines your safety management arrangements rather than supports them. So an example of this would be, perhaps you have a morning meeting where your staff team talk you through what their plans are, how their group are doing, what part of the lake they're going to, all of those sorts of things. In addition to that, you might have a signing on and off the water log. Well, having both of those things means that you're asking that group of people for the same information twice, albeit in slightly different ways. The on the water log is a classic. So we've had occasions where our inspectors have viewed on the water logs which have suggested that an instructor might have been out on the lake since 2016. They signed out, they never signed back, and nobody noticed or followed it up. So if those processes are not genuinely required for you to effectively manage your provision, then having them becomes a distraction and potentially becomes something which will undermine your arrangements in future. So do you need them? The next point to raise is the Ronseal test, as it's flippantly referred. So do your arrangements effectively and correctly describe how you operate? So if I spend a day in your office reading all those things, and then I spend the next day out observing activities taking place, sailing being delivered, windsurfing going on, will I have a common understanding from both of my days, or will there be a gap between the two? Obviously, you'll only know the answer to that if you really know both the provision that takes place in reality and the safety management procedures and documentations which are intended to support that. But having a gap between those invites problems. It suggests that either you're not familiar with exactly how it is you operate out on the water, or it suggests that your arrangements have been written in a way which has been ignored, and that hasn't been noticed and addressed. So the Ronseal test, do they reflect what you do? Do they say the things that you do? Or is there a set of sort of commonly understood rules and procedures which perhaps are not written down, which your instructor team are working to, which don't particularly reflect the arrangements that you've defined within your safety management documentation? And then finally, do they address the significant and foreseeable hazards associated with the activity that you deliver in the locations that you deliver it? Are there gaps? One of the issues there, one of the difficulties there can be if you've tried to write a risk assessment, for example, in an isolated sense. So you've sat down and tried to come up with a list of the risks and hazards associated with the delivery of activity. It's quite easy to miss something. An alternative approach which we see working well is where someone has followed a session from the very start all the way through to the end, either literally or metaphorically, and have tried to identify the hazards in that way. They've almost gone on a journey through the session. So recognizing the hazards as they crop up in the session itself. Doesn't mean you have to present it in that way, although you might choose to. But what it does mean is by approaching it in that way, you're much more likely to have a thorough list and a complete list of the significant hazards within the session that you're delivering. The final two things I want to mention on this section is, firstly, do those operating procedures and risk assessments match the competencies of those working within them? So it's quite reasonable that you might have extensive operating procedures. It's equally reasonable that you might have very, very slim operating procedures. Both of those might be entirely appropriate. Are or not will depend on the competence and the arrangements of your instructors. So if your team are particularly experienced and competent and able to operate with a level of autonomy, then it would be appropriate to have an operating procedure which allowed them to exercise the skills, experience and knowledge they've developed. The alternative is to create a very restricted situation in which those individuals are likely to become bored and disinterested in what they're not allowed to do. Equally, if your staff team are predominantly seasonal, perhaps they're relatively inexperienced, then the level of guidance and support they're going to require from those operating procedures or instructor guides or whatever else you use is going to be much greater, because they're not yet in a position to make those decisions and those calls for themselves. And therefore they need a much tighter level of support and guidance to ensure that they make those calls appropriately and to help them develop the experience, their own experience. So do they match? Do the operating procedures, risk assessments and general principles of safety management you've applied match the competence of those people that are expected to work within them? And then finally, I know I mentioned finally earlier, but this one really is finally, have you updated those operating procedures and those risk assessments based on the lessons you've learned from last year? Either the lessons you learned internally or those that you become aware of externally. So do they reflect a current understanding of your safety management arrangements? The next area I want to look at was in relation to equipment. So the first question, I guess, particularly if you are preparing for your season ahead, is your equipment currently fit for purpose for the start of the season? Has it been checked by a competent person whose entire focus has been on that equipment? They're not doing so because they're about to go on a session and they've got the pressures of people waiting for that. They are doing so because that is their key task today. That check is focused on the equipment itself, not on the records which might reflect it. And their role is to consider whether that equipment is fit for purpose now and whether that equipment is likely to remain fit for purpose for the duration of your season. It would be sensible to record the fact that they're doing that, but to try and identify a relatively simple recording system to avoid their focus being distracted by the amount of record keeping they feel they need to keep. It's too easy to create a situation in which those checking equipment can become focused on filling in the form or the IT click box or whatever it is that you're using, rather than their entire focus being on, is this a piece of equipment fit for purpose? Once we've completed that process, do we then have a system for checking it remains so during the season, and or for removing it from use if it doesn't? And that needs to cover all of the equipment we may possibly use, not just the stuff we generally use. So many of the providers that our inspectors will visit will have a general store, and then somewhere or other they'll have tucked away some other equipment which they might use either on particular busy days or for particular groups. And it's important that your equipment checking regime covers everything you have, not just the stuff you use on a day-to-day basis. One of the other issues is, how do you maintain the checking of equipment on a day-to-day basis? And the questions we're regularly asked is, well, how do I do that, and do I need to write that down? Well, most providers would expect their instructors to be checking equipment as and when they issue it to participants. So they might be standing at the stores handing out buoyancy aids, and they'd be expecting their instructors to check that the zips and the clips on that buoyancy aids are sound, as well as obviously that it's a good fit for the individual they're handing it to. So one way to check whether those operational checks, as we call them, are effective is to do a mid-season check of all of your equipment. And really, that mid-season check, you're not expecting to find things which are damaged, because you are expecting those to have been removed as and when they crop up on a daily basis when your staff team are issuing that equipment for use. So those mid-season checks or periodic checks during your season are really there to provide you with reassurance that your operational checks are being applied and are identifying equipment as and when it becomes no longer fit for purpose. If you find lots of equipment during those checks which isn't fit for purpose, then that's a different thread. That's telling you that actually that's about whether your instructional team are understanding the reason for those checks, are conducting those checks, and are effectively managing equipment they find is not fit for purpose as a result of those checks. The sort of thread we were referring to earlier. One of the other issues to think about here is, are you introducing new equipment this season? So that might be new boats if you've been successful in some fundraising or whatever, right down to a different first aid kit, a different bucket in the powerboat that holds all the stuff, whatever it may be. It's important whenever new equipment is introduced that you've considered the implications for that in terms of its daily use. Are your team familiar with it? Are your team even aware that that change has taken place? I think it would be inappropriate for the first time an instructor discovers that there is new equipment to be during an activity session when they're about to turn to use it and discover it's not quite as they expected it to be. Particularly poor examples of this that we've experienced have been where engine control systems in powerboats have been changed. So I've been driving a powerboat for 2 or 3 years, and it's always had the same engine control system. I get into it at the start of this season, and the location of that system or the use of that system has changed entirely, and I discover that as I get in the boat to start delivering my session. That can't be right. I need to have been inducted into the use of that equipment and understand its implications before I'm required to use it as part of a well-managed, safe and quality session. So the next in our list of 5 is to talk about instructors. So firstly and simply, are they competent? And that isn't the same thing as do they have a current OIA qualification? Having a qualification tells us that person was able to perform the required skills within the syllabus and demonstrate the appropriate knowledge and in some cases judgment during the assessment itself. It tells us no more than that. It does not tell us whether they're familiar with your particular systems, your equipment, your location. It doesn't tell us whether they'll be familiar with how you like to manage potentially faulty equipment. It doesn't tell us that they'll understand how you want accidents to be managed and dealt with and then recorded and reviewed. It also doesn't tell us whether those skills and judgments are current. It tells us that they were at that standard at that time, but it doesn't tell us what's happened in the meantime. So competence, as opposed to qualification in the broader sense, requires much more than having seen evidence of an appropriate qualification. And that brings me on to the next point, which is a slight tangent perhaps. Plumbers generally don't do electrics. So does the qualification, induction, training and broader competence which a particular member of your team has cover the full range of tasks that you might ask that instructor to undertake? There are some incredibly competent DIs out there who know nothing about stand-up paddleboarding. Equally, there are some incredibly competent SIs out there who know nothing about sit-on-top kayaking. So what is it that your provision requires of the team, and how are you able to demonstrate that they are appropriately competent? Remember, that's not just qualified, appropriately competent for you to deploy them to those tasks. That's perhaps going to be a particular concern for the 2022 season, given that many of those individuals will have been locked down or inactive for the last season or two, and also because many of them will have gone off and found other work and other industries in which to work in. So not only are they likely to be less available, but those that are available are likely to be less current in their experience, less current in their competence than previously you might have expected. So have you got a plan for how you're going to ensure that those individuals are ready to undertake the full range of tasks you might deploy them to? And then the last area that I wanted to talk about this morning was emergency action procedures. And what I'm going to suggest is probably the best thing that you could do as part of your preparation for the 2022 season is to have a major accident or incident. Not a real one, obviously, but a full scenario-based training event where you run through, using your current emergency action procedures, a significant accident or incident. It takes time to do that well. It is not a straightforward process. But taking the time to plan it effectively, to then run through it effectively, and then most importantly, the time to review that process afterwards can be incredibly worthwhile in making sure that your emergency procedures are fit for purpose and will work if that day comes, but also for reminding all of those people involved in those procedures quite what that requires, how it feels, what actions are required of them, and then to conduct a review which doesn't try to identify who didn't quite do it right, but a review which tries to identify how we all need to operate in our given roles in order to most effectively manage what will be a stressful and difficult situation. When was the last time that your club, centre or organisation conducted a scenario-based training event around a significant accident, incident or a fatality? Elements which can be missed within the emergency procedures are things like lone working and instructor incapacitation. The situation of your particular organisation and the location of it will mean those are more or less of an issue. But certainly wherever instructors are working with groups away from the main centre itself, then instructor incapacitation is a significant issue. Would your groups know what to do if it was their instructor who was incapacitated rather than one of them? How do you decide what they should do, and how do you share that information with them in a way which isn't alarmist but does allow them to deal with it should it happen? So some of the most effective safety management systems that we see have some fairly common threads, and one of those threads is that the organisation hasn't tried to separate its safety management arrangements from everything else it does. So it doesn't have a file or a drawer in the office where all the risk assessments and operating procedures live, and then it has real life going on everywhere else. It has effectively integrated those processes. And in that way, it means that the staff from the principal right down to the AI is operating within that culture of safety management at all times. Examples are good risk assessments allow organisations to provide genuinely adventurous activities. Risk assessments are not a process to restrict us from doing things. They're a process to allow us to do things, having first considered the risks and decided how we can control them. Good induction processes help instructors to do the best job possible. They're there to support those instructors in operating in a way which we think reflects safety and quality. And having an overall culture of safety within an organisation requires everybody to understand that, as opposed to viewing it as a separate entity, something that's for inspections and odd occasions during the season. And making those arrangements, putting those systems in place, means that those responsible for the provision, whether that's trustees, committee members, managers or principals, can then actually enjoy the opportunities their organisation is providing to its members, to its visiting groups and to its staff, knowing that they have an effective safety management system in place to support them. So as I said at the beginning, I've thought about the areas which commonly can cause difficulties for providers, and I've put those into an order which you might like to think about in terms of the next 8 to 10 weeks if you're preparing for a season. But also there may well have been individual elements of that which are perhaps more useful to you than others, in which case that's fine. I'm not suggesting that's a blueprint for the 2022 season. I hope that's been of use and of interest to you, and I wish you all a good season. Thanks very much and goodbye.